In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives how to fight
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Arma verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam pato profugos lavina qui venet litera. Mult millet terris iactatus et alto vi superum, saevae memorem unionis albiram. Multa quoque et bello passus, dum conderet urbem, inferet quideos latio, genus unde Latinum Albanique patres, et qualtae moenia Romae. Musa mihi causas memora. Quo numine laiso? Quid fidolens regina Deum tot volvere casus, insignem pietate verum, tot adire labores impulerit. Tantaina.
How's that for an opening? Welcome to Lesson 7 of our series on living literature. You just saw A.D. Nuttall, Tony Nuttall, member of the New College Oxford faculty. He's in English studies, not in classical studies, but obviously he is well versed in classical studies, and he just read some of the most famous lines in world literature. Maybe the most famous opening line in classical literature is Arma verumque cano, Arms and the Man I Sing, which kind of predicts for us the theme of the epic. You remember Iliad opening with the word menis, the Greek word wrath, which becomes the theme of the epic. Virgil, building on the epic convention of Homer, who came before him, does exactly the same thing. He opens with statement of theme, and after Virgil, this then becomes the epic convention, the opening lines of the poem announcing the theme. I love this poem. I'm going to tell you that flat out. This takes me back to high school Latin, when in my senior year I struggled 75 lines a night to translate Virgil's Aeneid. Those of you who have had a Latin background will probably sympathize with that. I absolutely hated it at the time. I was a 17-year-old Brooklyn punk, you know, and the idea of translating Aeneid was a rather silly thing, I thought, to do. Another epic. You guys did a kind of epic journey this morning. I should tell our audience watching us via videotape that we are right smack in the middle of one of Chicago's best and or worst winter storms, and we have visibility of about 3 centimeters out there and a foot of snow, and yet you all made it, and I applaud you for that. Let's start as we normally do with questions. I want you not to be intimidated by this poem, and that's easier said than done. Whereas Homer wrote a folk epic, Virgil writes an art epic, what is known as an art epic. It is self-consciously artistic. He uses Homeric parallels. You've all picked that up, I'm sure, in your reading for today. He's much more consciously the artist than Homer is. And Virgil, of course, is then celebrated in medieval and Renaissance literature, and he really is put up on a pedestal. And I prefer that we not read him that way. That is, that we not just assume that this is some great classic and we have to handle it with kid gloves. But let's start with questions. What questions do you have? Yeah, Barbara.
I was wondering, since Virgil seemed to copy, in a way, some of Homer's, or he built upon Homer's works. Mm-hmm. Do you think he felt he was cheating a little, or
yeah, good question.
How
yeah, good question.
That, I mean, nowadays that might be looked upon like you didn't do your own thing.
Yes, originality was not at the top of the artistic scale of values in the classical world, nor was it in the medieval world, nor was it in the Renaissance world. That really is a modern idea. Virgil depends upon his audience knowing Homer. He is writing for a learned audience. He's writing for an educated audience. He's writing for an upper class audience that is extremely well educated. So the notion of imitation, and that's a loaded word. We could spend an hour on that very concept of classical imitation. But that notion of imitation is built into the fabric of classical literature. And indeed, it's what makes the experience of reading the literature richer, because you do have that frame of reference. I'm sure you're feeling this now, maybe for the first time this term, that you're reading something, and instead of having to rely on little footnotes down at the bottom of the page for the analogs, you're doing it yourself. How different it is to have Andromache, and then a little footnote, and you look down to the bottom of the page, and it says, wife of Hector, who was killed at Troy. That doesn't do it, does it? I mean, it's the differences. I remember Harold Kushner talking about the difference between reading a menu and eating a meal. You know, you guys now are eating meals. You know, you don't have to rely on the menu anymore.
And then
So,
later,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Larry.
I'm saying, then later Dante built on
Precisely.
Virgil, and Shakespeare built on Herodotus.
That's
and
why we're
Plutarch's
moving the
life.
direction we're moving. Right. We're going to go right from Virgil to Dante next week. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's basically the themes of humanity are the same throughout the ages. I mean, he could have done it on his own, judging by what was going on at his time.
Yeah, I don't know that you're raising a good question. I don't know that Virgil is writing a kind of everyman epic. I don't think so, as a matter of fact. I think what he's doing is writing an epic his reasons are political. As much as they are artistic, although of course they are artistic. But the Rome of the 1st century BC, Virgil's dates are roughly 70 BC to 19 BC. The Rome, when Virgil is writing his epic, is a Rome not unlike our own country today. And what I mean by that is that Augustus is in power. You all know about Caesar Augustus, Octavius, who brings this great age of peace. The Pax Romana, you've probably heard of that. What's happening in Rome is all sorts of strange people are strange in quotation marks, please, don't misunderstand me. All sorts of strange people are coming into Rome and are questioning things. The political stability is starting to see some fissures. Strange tongues are in town. Strange customs are in town. It's a kind of multicultural society. And a multicultural society, to the Roman, is a real challenge, because Rome believed in its greatness. What's very interesting about this epic is that while Virgil celebrates the greatness of Rome, and he has no doubt about the greatness of Rome, it really was an extraordinary period in Roman history. Rome, the lawgiver, Rome, the peace bringer. Even as he does that, however, he undercuts the empire by suggesting the enormous price that must be paid for Rome's greatness, both on the individual level and on the societal level. So one of the impulses, there are many in the epic, and of course we falsify by even sorting them out, because they really are, it's not either or, it's really all. But one of the impulses in the epic is political. One of the things that Virgil is celebrating are those qualities in Aeneas that made Rome great. One of the things that an epic does, one of the things that makes epic different from tragedy that we talked about last two classes, the epic celebrates the hero, and the hero is the sum total of the values and virtues of that society. You all with me on that? So what we'll want to do this morning is start to define Aeneas as hero. It didn't take you very far, I'm sure, to figure out that Aeneas is very different from Achilles. My goodness, I mean, the first words out of Aeneas' mouth is, "I wish I had died in Troy." You can't imagine Achilles saying that, can you? It's unthinkable. Very different kind of hero. And we'll talk about that in considerable length. Not a flawless hero, huh? You've read Dido and Aeneas. You've read Book 4. This man is deeply flawed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very true.
Was it a clever literary device that Virgil lets Aeneas tell the story, gives an immediacy and a timely worth to the action? Instead of he could say, well, Aeneas said this, he did this, but Aeneas does the speaking, and I think it's more powerful.
I agree. That's part of another one of the conventions, actually, of epic that you're describing, is that the epic technique is largely dramatic. The narrator kind of sets the stage, puts the characters on the stage, and then he kind of withdraws from the stage. Now, I will also say that Virgil comes down onto the stage and makes comments during the course of the epic, much more so than Homer did. But you're absolutely right. It gives an immediacy to the action and an immediacy to the character that you would not otherwise have if it were a third-person narrative. Yeah.
But it rather displaces him as a writer, projecting Aeneas. You know, as you said, it casts him in the shadow, and he just comes in and makes comments.
Yeah. Yeah.
You forget about Virgil because you're so wound up with Aeneas.
Yeah, don't forget about Virgil. I really mean that. You're right. I mean, it's real easy to just blow through the authorial interruptions. Yeah, but don't. Let me ask you to be alert to them, because Virgil is pointing you. He's pointing your emotional reaction to things as well. I think that's very important in the epic.
He's taking the place of the chorus.
Ah, nice point. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, not really, because of course he's not participating in the action, but in the sense of guiding the emotional response. Yeah, your point is well taken. Yeah, yeah. Barbara?
Aeneas seems like a more human hero. He is flawed in the way all of us, can be flawed. He thinks, he feels more. I remember reading the Iliad many, many years ago and thinking Achilles was so terrific and wonderful of a hero, but I don't anymore. But Aeneas, you just relate to him more. He's more of a modern hero.
Ah, nice point. I want to return to that. Why is he modern? I want to come back to that in Book 2 and 4.
I feel that he feels more. And he doesn't always express it, but I just feel, of course, just in Book 4, I mean, that's all you really can go by. But there was so much more in him, I think, that he wanted to say. And because he was directed not to, he followed orders, and he bottled himself up.
Yeah.
And there was more.
Good point. Aeneas carries burdens that Achilles does not carry. We'll all agree with that immediately, right? I mean, it's so clear, isn't it? Achilles is a free agent. Achilles answers to no one but himself. He's very much a kind of boy. Aeneas, very different kind of hero. Aeneas can't listen to self. That's what I think you have to really hold on to in Book 4. There are lots of things he would love to do, but he can't do them. He has to learn to be a passive hero, which is an odd, almost oxymoron, a passive hero. But indeed, that's what he must do. He must learn that there are forces in control above him or greater than him. Those forces are gods and goddesses in the epic. They're also historical forces. Don't try to lose sight of the history that is embedded in this epic. For Homer, there's no history. For Virgil, it's history working itself out via the hero. Yeah. I want to return to this because it's a very important point. In a sense, European poetry grows up with the Aeneid, with this new kind of hero who carries burdens of past and future on his back and by his hand.
Is that what moves him beyond Oedipus and Creon? Virgil's references back to Homer raised questions about why is the Aeneid that much beyond Euripides? Is it the character of the hero, the progression from the tribe to the polis? Is it that Aeneas can't make individual decisions or prefers not to make individual decisions?
Yeah, good question. I'll take it a step further. We went from Iliad, from the tribe, to the Greek tragedies, to the polis. Now we're taking it even another step, and now we're in the realm of empire. You see the expanse? It's a much larger historical force that he's dealing with here. And the self has to be negated sometimes when the forces of empire are at work. We'll return to this in Book 4 because I think most of you don't like Aeneas at the end of Book 4, right? I mean, nobody likes Aeneas at the end of Book 4. What a jerk, right? What a jerk.
Well, no.
Not falling for my little verbal traps this morning.
He's human.
Yeah, but come on.
Well, when you've got that many gods and goddesses doing your thinking or pushing you where they think you ought to be for their benefit, you know, you've got to excuse them all. We don't have that.
Yeah, he says, I do not leave of my own free will. You know?
Right.
Yeah. And he says, don't think I was going to leave secretly, silently.
He wasn't going to go in the cave with her either. I mean, that was a setup.
Sure was.
Which she bought.
Sure was. Yeah. Yeah. All right, well, let's save that for the second hour. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Other questions? Anything?
How authentic are the stories that, in terms of tradition? Are there independent sources for these stories of Dido, for instance, and the fact that Rome is a Trojan colony, or was this stuff that Virgil just made up?
No, he did not invent it. No, he's dealing with history as his audience would understand it. Yeah, the old oral legends had the Romans coming out of Troy, out of the ashes of Troy, and rebuilding a new world in Hesperia, in the western land, in Italum, which was ruled by Italus. This question becomes actually more significant in the last 6 books of the epic, rather than in the first 6. The question, the historical question, really is important. You'll also see it in Book 6, our next. Where are we here? Not our next class, the next class after that. We're going to look at Book 6, where Aeneas takes a trip to the underworld, and he gets a view of the future, and you're going to see history, as Virgil understood it, laid out before Aeneas's eyes. So your question's very good, but let me give a shorthand answer by saying that he really is dealing with traditional material here, and history as his audience would have understood it. History and legend are obviously impossible to separate out at this point. But you'll see it played out. It's very important in Book 6 when he gets that future, that view of the future, which for us, of course, is a view of the past.
Did his audience understand all the names of characters and all the double names of
they'd have
cities?
grown up with the names, yeah.
They did?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they'd be familiar with
But we
almost all of them. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know. I hear you. There's nothing worse than having to go down to the bottom of the page for footnotes all the time, you know. I recommend on a first reading that you not do that, frankly. I always recommend to students on the first reading, just blow through it. Just read it through as a story. Let the narrative take you. Perhaps make marginal notes in your book saying, you know, Aeneas lands at Carthage, Dido commits suicide, or whatever's going on the page. You know, you kind of summarize it in the margin. Just read it for sense, for narrative sense first. And then if you have time, go back to it and read it a little bit more slowly to start to see the patterns. And the patterns are really very interesting in Virgil, much more so than Homer, much more artistic than Homer. And then, of course, we come to class and talk about it, and then if you're really model students, you go home and read it again on the basis of what's gone on in class, and suddenly it becomes a whole new text, right? It becomes a different text as a result of the discussion. That's what makes this such high-level fun, you know, is the text really does change on you. Yeah.
The woman was important in the Iliad, Helen, whereas here Dido plays an important role.
Oh, she sure does. Yeah.
So,
yeah, she sure does.
They don't forget the ladies.
No, they don't. Although there are some really misogynist things said. I mean, you remember Mercury coming down to Aeneas, I'm sure, telling him to hit the road. And he talks about fickle women and emotional women and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. The Roman society was a male society. I mean, it really hasn't changed a whole lot in several thousand years, but it's a strongly male society. And in fact, all of the virtues celebrated in the epic are traditionally male virtues. the virtues of virtus, V-I-R-T-U-S, which is a kind of strength, you know, a kind of manly courage, to use an old Victorian word, you know. Gravitas, very important characteristic of Aeneas. Remember Aeneas in Book 1, when they're feasting after their landing in Carthage? What is Aeneas doing? He's up on a cliff looking out, you know, and he's always worrying about his men, and he's thinking about what's next. And the classic Roman statue with the knitted brow, right? You look at a Greek statue and the face is impassive. You can't solve the face. You don't know what's going on in that head. You know, it's so calm. Whereas the Roman always has that knitted brow, you know, always that seriousness of purpose of the Roman, and you'll see that celebrated in the epic as well. Plus, of course, pietas, which I will not attempt to define for you yet, but it's the defining epithet for Aeneas. Pius, P-I-U-S, pious Aeneas. That's a nasty word today, right? Describe somebody as pious, and immediately you're thinking of Tartuffe, right? You're thinking of some hypocrite or something. Whereas for Virgil, it is the defining epithet.
You mean believing in the gods and following their way?
Essentially, I told you I wouldn't define it yet, but yeah, it's it's a loyalty. It's impossible to define it, but essentially it means loyalty to the gods, loyalty to the state, loyalty to family. You all hear that? They're all tied together. To the gods, to the state, to the family. I want you to think of the family as the state in miniature. That's the way the Roman would think of it. As the state is ruled by the emperor, so the family is ruled by the pater familias. And his authority was complete within the family. So when Anchises dies, it's really quite significant in this epic. Aeneas is fatherless for the first time. It's a moving moment where he has to become pater familias himself. He has to take on even more responsibility than he had before. So it's loyalty to the gods, loyalty to the state, loyalty to family, and also loyalty to one's fellows. So and even that doesn't capture it. It's a very difficult, dynamic kind of quality, kind of virtue that Aeneas has to win too. He is pious, to be sure, and indeed the prologue to the epic asks a rather disturbing question. Within the first 6 lines, Virgil asks a question of the gods. How could it be that a man so pious could be punished so severely by the gods?
Look at Job.
Questions all the way through the epic about the justice of the universe. Don't miss them. They're very important.
Here we are with Job again.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
yes, ma'am.
It's a wonderful.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
One of the things that Virgil does is creates among his gods forces of order and forces of disorder. And he does it he introduces you to it right away in the first book. Who sends the storm against Aeneas' fleet? Juno. Juno is the one who savages the Trojan fleet, right? With winds, you remember, and all that. She persuades Aeolus to let his winds out, and the fleet is buffeted. And then who calms them? Jupiter, through Neptune, calms. And then here you get your polar opposites. You'll see Jupiter, the Roman equivalent of Zeus, although this guy's much more serene, wouldn't you say, than Homer's Zeus, is the force of order in the poem, of creation, of possibility, whereas Juno is a force of passion, is a force of disorder, is a force for destruction, not only of others, but also of self. And you'll watch this drama play out during the course of the epic as these two forces meet during the course of the epic. Juno is the representative of furor impius, the opposite of pius, impious. And Juno is representative of furor. All right, we still use, it's the same word that we use today. You know, this kind of passionate, angry impiety. So you'll see these two forces balance off against one another during the course of the epic. So he explains all of this seeming injustice by putting it in the hands of those forces in the universe that represent disorder, that represent chaos.
Sometimes I think you want the hero to rail against the gods. Why have you provided this destiny for me when I would like to do some of my own acts on my own volition and not be so subject to the gods?
It's his piety. It's his piety that doesn't allow that. Yes. You do know, and indeed, if you read with sympathy Book 4, you do know, don't you, that Aeneas' heart breaks as he leaves there. Think of what Carthage means to him. He has been 7 years wandering the Mediterranean looking for a new home. It's a remarkable, remarkable book, but he's not allowed to rail against. That's self-indulgent. And no Roman would applaud that kind of self-indulgence. That's for us today. We're self-indulgent, you know. We want to whip ourselves and whine. We love to whine. And a Roman hero just will not whine. No whining. You know, get on with it. Yeah.
But when he's talking with his men friends, he does tell them, you know, Mercury came down and told me this, so this is what we have to do. And then the question of Dido comes up. And he said, well, I'll have to think about that very carefully. So time marches on while he's thinking about what to say to her, to whom he's very close to, and has made vows and promises.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, absolutely true. I mean, you're right. It's part of the human dilemma that he finds himself in. He knows he's got to go, and he knows if he tells her he's going, all hell is going to break loose. Forgive the expression, but it will. I mean, she is a very passionate woman. She is in Felix Dido. She is poor, unhappy Dido. Yeah, he kind of weasels away, doesn't he?
Yeah,
it seems to be he weasels away.
like he intended to talk with her.
That's what he says, yeah.
But yeah, right, he's always saying that.
And you guys are going to really enjoy when he makes the trip to the underworld in Book 6 and meets Dido. Wait till you see Dido's reaction to him. It's fantastic. I won't tip it off, but you'll all go, oh, that's brilliant. It's just brilliant when he tries then to explain, you know, and she doesn't want to hear it. It's really a marvelous scene.
Just don't change.
Yeah, it's a marvelous scene.
Well, his men were essentially ready to go, I guess, too, which made them a lot easier to talk with.
Precisely, yeah.
They'd reinforce him.
Yeah.
Well, he's helpless in a way because she's reading what she wants to, and his every action or his rebuff she sees as a come on. I mean, she has made up her mind that she's going to have him, whatever it takes, and then for her to feel like he has done her in when she did everything and a little bit more to put herself in his path. And whatever he says, she takes as being encouragement of her.
Oh, sure.
She's
yeah.
blinded, but that's...
And she mistakes, and she makes a series of mistakes. I mean,
right.
the marriage notion of what happened in the cave is just not true. It might make her feel better, but it's simply not true.
Yeah.
And Aeneas, unfortunately, cops a legalism at the the end, and it makes him look like this coldly rational, unfeeling jerk.
But in the beginning, getting to their relationship in books 1 and 2, she's the queen. She has a kingdom and armies, and she's raising a city. And at first, they can't even get onto the territory because her shores are so well guarded. Right. And then eventually, someone does, and they're speaking with her about why can't I even set foot on the sand? You know, we've been.
Yeah. No surprise that these two would fall in love. I mean, here she is with everything he wants. You know, and their histories are the same. You know, both of them came out of the ashes of a fallen city. Both of them are alone. They've lost a spouse. Both of them are leaders of great forces, and they're missing only one thing, and that's a human connection. And, you know, no surprise that two people like this will ultimately wind up in that cave with or without Venus's intervention.
She's a very strong character, isn't she?
Yes, she
I mean,
sure is.
was there a woman character in the Iliad that could equal her in focus and strength?
No, not even close. In dignity, maybe Hecuba, and maybe Andromache in dignity, but certainly not in strength.
And did she have her brother killed? Her brother killed her husband.
That's correct.
And
Yeah.
then
For
she
gold.
somehow took care of her brother. So, I mean, she is a very powerful
She
figure.
is a very powerful woman. The Roman audience, of course, would think of whom as a historical analog?
Cleopatra?
Cleopatra, absolutely true, absolutely true. And Aeneas plays the role both of Mark Antony and Caesar Augustus at the same time for the Roman audience. Now that's lost on most of us because we don't have that kind of history at our fingertips, but it would not be lost on the Roman audience. And so Aeneas, when he seems most like Mark Antony, indeed he's even accused of being effeminate, remember, and having the gold braids on his purple garments and on his curly locks and all of that sort of stuff. Aeneas has to throw off the Mark Antony role and take on the Octavian role.
Yeah, but then she invites him and his men to come as equals.
That's correct.
Into this rising
She'll
kingdom.
make them Tyrians. Yeah.
Which was one of her first mistakes.
Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Possibly.
Yeah. I talked to Maynard Mack. You'll remember you saw a clip about Maynard Mack. At the very beginning of our series, he also knows his Virgil, and because I was there with him, I couldn't resist. And I asked him to comment on the change in moving from the Homeric epic to the Virgilian epic. And I think it might be instructive to see what he has to say, and then we'll come back out and talk about it. Aeneas is a new kind of epic hero, isn't he?
Yes, of course he is. For one thing, Virgil saw that the old kind of hero simply wouldn't do for the situation in his time, which was it reminds me very much of the situation in our time. The old order had broken down. The old Roman values, to use the modern term, had broken down. Family values, to use another modern term, had broken down. There had been vast immigration from the East of people who were not ethnically the same as the Italians and the Romans who had come together to form the Roman Empire, the Roman race originally. And there were, as the Romans saw it, insidious cults like some of the ones we have in California or have recently had in Texas, or, people looking around for something, because the old gods are gone too. And in this kind of a situation, with a vast collection of conquered peoples out there, Virgil saw that what was needed, and also was needed in Rome itself, the government, was a healer, a man who, in other words, we might say a statesman, a consensus getter, a guy who doesn't put himself first, but kind of puts the cause first, who is willing to be an agent. And that's, of course, what Aeneas has to learn how to do, to give up all the things that he would like to have had, all the things that he was used to. Troy, for example, which he would love to have died defending. That was his first impulse when he was fighting the Greeks in Book 2, but then he's told by his mother, a goddess, that there are concerns more important in the world than your personal glory. And you have to subdue your wishes to those. So the whole first part of the poem is a kind of education in how to become a leader, a statesman, or if you even like, in the good sense, a politician. Somebody who knows how to achieve consensus, who's willing to compromise, who, in other words, is willing to settle for the art of the possible rather than for the impossible thing that makes for tragedy. So it's really, it seems to me, a very, very thoughtful recognition of what his time needed and what all times need, essentially. Once the war is over, what you need is somebody to pick up and put the pieces together. That's what we need right now. And then I think, too, and this would be my sort of ultimate window on the Aeneid is that, like all the really great works in literature, it's about us. It shows us in Aeneas a picture of what, as fragile human beings, mortal, not given divine knowledge, what we have to do, how we have to somehow go forward to some vision we have of a good of some sort, without knowing that we'll ever reach there, not even knowing exactly what the good is, only kind of glimmerings of it. We have to give up a great deal to do that. We have to make choices, and then if we make the wrong choices, we have to live with the consequences, whether they're wrong or right. That's one of the things that the Aeneid seems to be, in the deeply human sense, is showing us. It shows us in our moments of...
Interesting observations there. The one I think that's most important for us, for our class anyway, although I think they were all important observations, is the notion that in the first 6 books of the epic, we watch the education of Aeneas. And I think that should be what you're looking at in the first 6 books. We want to know, what does he learn? He's a very interesting fellow. As I say, the first time we meet him, he wishes he had died at Troy. Why? Well, because that would be heroic, right? That's the old code. That's the old code. And he lives by the old warrior code. And what the poor fellow has to learn, as indeed the entire civilization has to learn, is that old code is dead. And a new code has to replace it. So what you'll watch in the first 6 books, there are any number of levels of conflict going on in the epic. We've talked about one already, which is the cosmic conflict between fate, Jupiter, and counter fate, Juno, between reason and passion. All right. Aeneas struggles with a similar kind of conflict. From one point of view, the first 6 books are about Aeneas learning to control his own passions. Just as the first scene of the epic is Jupiter calming Juno's storm, so the first simile in the epic, and let's take a look at that if we might. The first simile occurring as Neptune calms the seas. And we're going to have a little trouble with page reference because we're all dealing with different anthologies. Book 1. Yeah, this is book 1. This is the very first epic simile in the epic. And it occurs after Neptune calms the seas. And he uses a simile from contemporary life. He says, "And just as in a great crowd where tempers are high and the rowdies are milling and sticks and stones are flying," you all in the scene? "For rage finds weapons to hand. Then if by chance they see some man who has won true respect, they quieten down and are ready to hear him speak. And by his argument he will soothe their passion. So fell to silence the tumult of the deep as the Father of Seas looked out across his kingdom, and then with a cloudless heaven above his head gave loose rein to his horses and let his chariots rip." It's a great simile, isn't it? It's the reasonable man calming the passions of the mob. And indeed, this simile establishes, it seems to me, the polar opposites in the poem. You have the furor, the madness of the mob, the passion of the mob, seen also in the winds, right, of the storm, seen also in Juno, and then you have pietas, the kind of reasoned virtue that calms the passions and ultimately will prevail in the epic. Unfortunately for Aeneas, he is the one that has to make it happen. So in the first 6 books, in the Odyssean portion of the Iliad, I'm sure you read all your introductions point out that the structure of the epic is really quite clear. The first 6 books are the Odyssean portion of the epic. The last 6 books are the Iliadic portion of the epic. and Virgil would expect his audience to make that connection. In the first 6 books, Aeneas' struggle is, yes, with forces outside of himself, but much more importantly, it seems to me, the struggle with forces inside of himself. He must learn to control his passions, but to do so is to do so at great human cost. And here is the new hero. Here is a whole new form of suffering when one must control the self. In the last 6 books, he fights the impii, the impious. That's a plural form for the impious. He fights. When he comes out of book 6, he is reborn. He does a trip to the underworld. You're going to love this because on the same day we're going to do Dante, as well makes another trip to the underworld. In book 6, he takes a trip into the underworld and confronts his past. He moves through his past. That's why he meets Dido, gets a vision of the future, and he comes out of book 6, pater Aeneas. First time the epithet is used. You all get it? His gaze now is clearly forward. No more looking back. He is perfectly in control. Maybe. Because you'll see the final act in the epic is just so ironic, you can't believe it. The final act is, I'll tell you, the final act is Aeneas running Turnus through in a moment of rage. Oh, that's a very puzzling. We'll puzzle over this next week. It's a puzzling ending. So you all with me here that we have several levels then on which the epic can be profitably read. Yes, it can be read for the simple narrative, but it can also be read for its historical implications. And it can also be read as a kind of didactic work. And that's what Mack, I think, was suggesting, that probably the impetus for Virgil writing this thing was to instruct his age on those values and those virtues that made Rome great, but also because Virgil is Virgil, a very sensitive man, a very gentle man. He is also painfully aware of the cost of all of this, both for the individual and for the empire. Not at all different, is it, from a lot of what's going on in our modern culture today, if you think about it. I mean, isn't every film coming out of England about the end of empire? And how bankrupt the upper classes were? You know, how many more of these Anthony Hopkins films are we going to see, you know? And, you know, American films, you know, Last of the Mohicans and all those, yes, the great American empire, but what a cost, you know? Look at Aeneas and his men when they land in Carthage. And then I'll come to, what's the first act that's performed? Do you remember? The very first thing they do when they land in Carthage?
They kill the game.
They kill 7 deer. Is exactly right. The very first act is an act of destruction. Poor Aeneas, every step he takes toward fulfilling Roman destiny is causing suffering for someone. They are not, you can't separate them out. It both advances the great empire and the idea of the empire, and it also is destructive. It's all done via a hunt. Now, do you remember Dido and Aeneas in book 4? How many references to the hunt do you see in book 4? It's loaded with hunting imagery, of course. The very first act, they shoot the deer, you know. And in book 4, Aeneas is again an unwitting hunter. He doesn't mean to be doing this, you know, but these are the consequences for him. Yeah.
I like that part where the simile was like a hunter who just shoots his arrow at random and happens to kill a beast he does, or wound a beast that he hasn't even seen.
That's exactly right.
It was chance or the gods.
Yeah, it was not his intention, in short, to cause this kind of suffering for Dido or for himself. Phyllis, you want to make?
Yes, Maynard Mack made a comment about this hero not being tragic, I think, unless I misheard him, because he learns to do the possible rather than the impossible.
Yeah.
But that seems a little at odds with itself, that statement.
Yeah, what do you make of it? You've made the observation, now what do you make of it?
Well, to me it's more tragic to do the only possible rather than the impossible.
Yeah, we want to ask about Aeneas, whether he is a tragic... We all agreed, didn't we, that Achilles was tragic in the Iliad. Will we say that Aeneas is tragic as well? We're not prepared to answer that question yet. We're too early in the epic to answer that question, but you might put that one on the back burner, and we'll return to it when we look at the last 6 books of Aeneid.
Something else that Mac said, that's his name?
Yes, Maynard Mac. Yeah.
Were choices. He brought up the word choices. And I'm just thinking about people that we have read prior to this. Antigone and Aeneas make hard choices. They make choices that are not for personal gain, whereas some of the other men, such as Agamemnon and Oedipus, are more personally involved in their choices for their own gain.
Good observation. Absolutely true. Yep. Yep. Both, it's a nice connection you make between Antigone and Aeneas in the sense that both are making choices at the behest of a will almost other than themselves. Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch with Antigone because she's a little problematic, but certainly Aeneas is. Aeneas in Book 2, what does Aeneas want to do? He wants to keep running back into the fight. You know, that's what his instincts tell him to do. He wants to fight. He wants to save Troy, and it takes 3 messengers to finally get him going, to get out of there. Your duty is to leave, not to stay. And that's just unthinkable to him, but he must do it. He doesn't want to do it. He then spends all of the next book trying to, in Book 3, which you have not read, but in Book 3 he makes 10 landings attempting to recreate the past. And it's very difficult for him to learn that you can't do that. And especially when you're bearing, as he does, remember at the end of Book 2, bearing all of the past on his shoulders in the form of his father, as Anchises on his back, and he's leading little Iülus, little Ascanius, the future, by the hand. What a marvelous tableau that is. It's just one of the great scenes in literature. He's lost his wife. I mean, think of what he loses in the first books. 3 times he tries to throw his arms around Creüsa's neck. Remember when Creusa makes the appearance at the end of Book 2? And 3 times the ghost just slithers away. He wants her so badly. He wants her so badly, and he can't. She's the past. He has to learn to leave her behind, just as in Book 3 he's going to have to learn to leave Anchises behind. Anchises will die as well. And he's kind of all alone. He's got his son, to be sure, something that Dido doesn't have. And I want to make that point. That's all makes Aeneas all the more compelling to her. Is that she does not have a child.
But she yearned to have a child.
She sure did.
Yes.
She sure did. That's a good, nice human touch, a nice small detail, but makes the relationship between the two so believable in Book 4. It's so highly motivated. Beautiful set piece.
That she wanted to have his child.
Yeah. I start to read for patterns of imagery, too. There's so much imagery I want you to pay attention to. I don't even know where to begin. Do pay attention to the hunt motif.
Where the young boy runs ahead down the hill, charging ahead gleefully into his future.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. Yeah. Pay attention to the hunt. And when you first meet Dido, he frames her with two characters. This is a real detail question. I don't know if you're going to remember it, but when you first meet Dido, he frames her. Do you know what I mean by a framing device? He has one person here, then Dido, then another person here. Do you remember who they were? It's Penthesilea, the Amazon queen, you know, the hunter. And then you meet Dido, and then Diana, goddess of the hunt. Yeah, the hunt imagery is everywhere. If you're alert to it, you'll find it just pervading Book 4, and hints of it in Book 1 as well, preparing you for Book 4. Again, remember, this is a self-consciously artistic epic. This is not accident, believe me. Book 2 is dominated by 2 images, both images of destruction: fire and serpents. Lots of serpents. Did you notice all the serpents? If you read this in Latin, you'd really pick it up, because even the Trojan horse coming in, being pulled through the gate, the verb that's used is insinuat. It slides through.
That's the modern phrase, beware of Greek
sparing gifts, right.
But,
and remember, who's the Greek who sets them up? Remember, what Virgil has to do here, of course, is have you sympathize with Troy. Consider his problem here. you all know why this war occurred. It's because of Paris, and the stealing of Helen. So now we've got to sympathize with Troy. How's he going to do that? Well, he makes the Trojans these wide-eyed innocents, Oh, we felt so sorry for the guy, we let him in. And we feel, they wouldn't lie to us. And, it's just like, oh, boy, Sinon. Yes, remember the Greek Sinon. S-I-N-U-S, the form. Sinus, coil. Sinon is a snake, What happens to Laocoon?
Yes, he and his sons
both killed by snakes who come from
the sea.
Yeah, from Tenedos, which is where the Greeks are. Remember? And 2 serpents, Gemini serpents, come over. And of course, who is over there in Tenedos as all this is happening? Gemini Atreidae. Atreus's 2 sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus. You'll see, So it's all done in serpent imagery. Sleep comes over them in the form of serpent imagery. Virgil does about 5 lines of S sounds as the sleep comes over them, and you can almost hear the snake hissing as the sleep takes their limbs. As I said, the Trojan horse comes in insinuat. And of course, everything hangs fire. There's a marvelous article by a man named Bernard Knox entitled The Serpent and the Flame. And it's a very brief article. I recommend it to you highly. It's about 8 pages, maybe 10 pages long. And it talks about this imagery in Book 2. And it really is quite remarkable. If you didn't pick that up on your first reading, if you'll go back and read Book 2, you'll just be shaking your heads on how you could possibly have missed it. It is just everywhere in the book.
There too, they don't listen to the prophets. Coppius and Laocoon, warn them, to at least check in the belly, but they won't do it.
We never listen to prophets. Remember Laocoon, though, Cassandra's is, of course, that's Cassandra's curse, is that no one will ever listen to.
And she'd always be right.
Yeah. Barbara.
I have a question of you, since it sounds like you've read these in Latin.
Yes,
before.
I translated this,
And I'm not familiar with it, but these are translations that we're reading.
Yes.
Do you feel we are losing something?
Oh, definitely. Yes, of course. Nothing.
This is beautiful, but I'm wondering just how they could even translate it for us to be this beautiful.
It's very
what it must have happened then.
It's
and I was wondering how you felt about that.
Yeah, it's just very difficult. I don't know what to tell you. You lose a lot of the verbal artifice in the translation. I mean, there's just no way around it. Very difficult to do. Yeah, very difficult to do.
And still come out as a work of art.
Yeah, that's why this keeps getting translated. This is remarkable, the number of translations of Virgil in print. It's really quite remarkable. There are lots of them in print, and each taking a slightly different emphasis, but each trying to capture the tone of the work. And I can't stress enough the tone. It's captured in a very famous 3 Latin words: sunt lacrimae rerum.
Lacrimae is tears.
Yes, literally it means these are the tears of things. That's a literal. That's the way I would translate it, because I'm not a good translator. I would do it literally. These are the tears of things. Other translators, of course, run with those 3 words and turn them into something. But essentially, this is Aeneas when he comes to Carthage and sees the Trojan mural, and he weeps at the Trojan mural as he sees Priam, and he says, even here, people sympathize with our former selves.
I've been wondering why there are so many translations. And in the beginning, I happen to have Dickinson.
Yeah.
And he says they've been translated a number of times, and the justification that a translator has, he wants to make a great work of art live for the people he lives with, so that with each age, their circumstances are what will give them more or a different emphasis on the same work.
Right. Dickinson is a much more muscular translation than, just by chance, I brought a few. Here's a C.D. Lewis one, which I don't particularly like. It seems terribly old-fashioned and stilted compared to Dickinson. But the best, I think, is this one, the Mandelbaum. Although the Fitzgerald one that's in your anthology gets the most gets the most sales, I got to tell you. But I think this one's also terrific, the Mandelbaum translation.
May I ask where we can find this Bernard Knox, The Serpent and the...
Yeah, the easiest way is to find it in a book entitled Virgil, 20th Century Views, a collection of essays, which I just happen to have in my bag, so if you want to read it, I'll give it to you. Yeah. It's a nice collection. It's part of the 20th Century Views series, which is a series of paperbacks that collect good articles on works. Yeah, it's quite good. It's a terrific article.
The serpent takes us back to Adam and Eve.
Yeah. There's a lot of that,
Yeah.
looking back with longing on where you've been, but having to proceed.
Yeah. Don't lose sight of the humanity of these people. That's the thing I want to stress the most. Please understand that Aeneas and his men have wandered 7 years on the basis of some vision. You know, I mean, come on here, you know? Hector appears in a vision and says, you got to go, you know? And Creusa appears in a vision and says, you've got to go. And Mercury appears in a vision and says, you've got to go. This isn't tangible stuff here, you know? I mean, this is all dreamland he's in. And he's trying as best he can to found a city for his people, and he has suffered greatly in those 7 years. And when he lands in Carthage, boy, does he want to stay. Is this not everything he wants, you know, right here? And the poor Carthaginians, the first metaphor to describe them. Do you remember the first simile for the Carthaginians? Don't you hate these questions? How dare I ask? Yeah, I'm sorry. They're compared to bees. Right? Yeah, remember that? They're compared to bees. This city is alive. Towers are going up, remember? Everybody's working. Everybody's got an assigned task. This is everything Aeneas wants, you know? By book 4, what's happened to the activity in the city of Carthage? It's all stopped.
They're busy elsewhere.
They're dallying. Yeah, they are busy elsewhere. They're indulging themselves. And we have to, as a modern audience, that's a struggle for us because we love to indulge, don't we? Indeed. I'd love to be in that cave with Dido, you know? I mean, really. I mean, Aeneas is a flesh and blood guy, you know? Of course they're going to wind up in the sack, you know? Of course they are. But look at the cost. That's what we have to keep in mind, the cost.
Does Aeneas feel that he is destined, he is a man chosen, a destined man? That
Absolutely.
I mean, he really does feel that.
Absolutely. And he embraces it after book 6. He struggles against it in the first 6 books. And then he embraces it in the last 6 books. So these first 4 books set us up, in a way, for the death of the old Aeneas and the rebirth of the new, because in the first 4 books what we watch is the movement from the old world of enmity with the Greeks to a new world where he can befriend a Greek, Archimedes. That's the end of our hour. We'll see you next time. Yeah.